The Arizona dusty wind, hot and relentless, drove thin streams of sand down the desert road, twisting like snakes and dissolving into the shimmering haze of the horizon. Michael Henderson, sitting behind the wheel of his battered Ford pickup, looked at this endless ribbon of asphalt disappearing into nowhere and felt his heart beat in time with the rumble of the engine. He was 38, and he had long since grown accustomed to the loneliness of these roads, where his only companions were faded billboards and the occasional cactus sticking out of the ground like silent desert sentinels. But today a new fire burned in his chest, not the kind that kindles in the heat of the midday sun, but the kind that flares up when a person is in love. In love so much that the whole world seems like a backdrop to this one, blinding truth. Michael adjusted the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his reflection. His face, weathered by sun and time, with a light stubble and wrinkles around his eyes, still bore traces of the boyish smile that had once won hearts in small-town Tucson. He was a different man now, a successful but tired owner of a chain of car washes called Henderson Clean, which, as he liked to joke, kept Arizona cars cleaner than a preacher's conscience. His business grew like weeds in the rainy season, bringing in enough money to afford a house overlooking the Santa Catalina Mountains, a brand new Cadillac for ceremonial drives, and even a couple of vacations a year on the California coast. But it all seemed empty to him until she, Savannah Blake, came into his life. Savannah. Even her name sounded like a melody that you wanted to hum over and over again. Michael had met her 6 months ago in Las Vegas, in one of those noisy casinos where neon flooded everything and time lost its meaning. He was there on business, negotiating the delivery of new equipment for car washes, but he decided to devote one evening to himself, deciding that a couple of cocktails and roulette would not hurt. She appeared at the bar like a mirage in the desert, tall, with long wavy hair the color of ripe wheat, in a dress that hugged her figure as if it were woven from light. Her eyes, green, with a slight spark of mischief, caught his gaze, and Michael, usually confident and firm, felt the ground slipping from under his feet. "What does a man who looks at the world as if he's seen it all before drink?" she asked then, sliding into the chair next to him. Her voice was soft but slightly husky, as if she'd just finished singing the blues in a smoky bar. Michael, not expecting such a start, laughed, almost spilling his whiskey. "Someone who's seen it all usually drinks something stronger than this," he replied, nodding at his glass. "But I don't think I'm ready for tequila yet. What about you? What does a woman who looks like she knows all the secrets of this city drink?" She smiled, and her smile was both warm and dangerous, like the sun that beckons but can burn. "I drink what makes the night last longer," she replied, ordering a martini with 2 olives. "But you didn't answer. What are you doing here, other than trying to look cool with that whiskey?" That's how their story began, with a light flirtation that turned into long conversations until the early hours, with walks along the strip where they laughed at the ridiculous signs and tourists, with her stories of a life full of adventures and his stories of how he built his business from scratch. Savannah was younger than him, she was 27, but there was a maturity about her, mixed with a sass that made Michael feel alive. She was a mystery he wanted to solve, and at the same time a woman with whom he felt at home. Now, 6 months later, they were driving down Highway 89, heading to the small town of Sedona, where they would be married in 2 days. Savannah sat next to him, her bare feet resting on the dashboard, her long floral skirt hiked up slightly to reveal tan skin. She was humming as she leafed through a travel magazine, and every now and then she would glance at Michael in a way that made his heart do somersaults. "Are you sure your sister won't hate me?" she asked, not looking up from her magazine, but her tone was light, almost playful. Michael chuckled, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Liz, she doesn't hate anyone. She's just worried. You know, big sister always thinks I'm going to get into trouble." "And are you in trouble?" Savannah turned to him, her eyes flashing like 2 emeralds in the sun. He smiled, feeling warmth spread through his chest. "If falling in love with you means trouble, then I'm ready to get into trouble again and again." She laughed, and her laughter was like the ringing of bells that echoed in his soul. But somewhere in the back of Michael's mind, a shadow of doubt flickered. His friends, especially his old pal Tony, and his sister Liz really weren't thrilled about the wedding. "Too soon, Michael," Tony said, sipping beers at their favorite bar in Tucson. "You barely know her. Where did she even come from? Las Vegas, seriously. That's where people lose money, not find love." Liz was gentler, but her words cut just as hard. "I just want you to be happy, but are you sure she's who she says she is?" Michael brushed them aside as if they were pesky flies. He was in love, and that feeling was stronger than any doubt. Savannah wanted this wedding as much as he did. She had suggested a ceremony in Sedona, surrounded by red rocks and sunset skies that she said would be a blessing to their love. She had chosen the dress, discussed the menu, laughed as she imagined them dancing under the stars. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Michael couldn't help but succumb to it. But now, as they approached Sedona, he felt a little tense. Not because of the wedding, he was confident in his decision, but because of what awaited them in the city. His friends and family were already there, and he knew their questioning eyes would be watching Savannah's every move. He wanted to protect her from that, wanted her to feel wanted, but deep down he knew he couldn't make everyone love her the way he did. "Michael," Savannah's voice broke him out of his thoughts. She had put the magazine down and was looking at him with a small smile. "You haven't changed your mind, have you?" He turned to face her, and her gaze, full of warmth and something else he couldn't quite place, made his heart clench. "Change your mind?" he asked, feigning a frown. "Woman, I spent half my fortune on the ring you're wearing. If I change my mind, I'll have to sell all the car washes to cover the losses." She laughed, raising her hand to admire the ring's simple but elegant, with a small diamond that sparkled like a star in the desert sky. "It's perfect," she said quietly, and there was so much sincerity in her voice that Michael felt the last of his doubts dissolve like sand in the wind. They pulled into Sedona as the sun was setting, painting the red rocks crimson and gold. The town was small but lively, with cozy cafes, galleries selling local art, and tourists snapping pictures of everything. Michael pulled the truck up to the small hotel where they would be staying until the wedding. It was the place Savannah had chosen, a boutique hotel overlooking a canyon, with exposed beams and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the desert. "Here we are home," he said, turning off the engine and turning to face her. "Just for a couple of days now," she replied, leaning down to kiss him. Her lips were soft, warm, and in that kiss was the promise of everything that was to come. But when they got out of the car, Michael noticed Savannah pause for a moment, looking off into the distance. Her face, usually so open and sunny, became serious for a second, almost tense. He followed her gaze, but saw only desert and dark silhouettes of rocks. "What is it?" he asked, taking her hand. She blinked, as if waking up, and smiled, but her smile seemed to him a little less bright than usual. "Nothing," she said. "Just the desert. It always seems so alive, doesn't it? Like it holds some secrets." Michael nodded, but her words left him with a strange feeling, as if sand that the wind had picked up from the road had settled somewhere deep in his soul. The evening in Sedona was warm, with a faint scent of juniper in the air. Michael and Savannah were sitting in the hotel restaurant at a table by the window overlooking the canyon, illuminated by the soft light of the moon. The table was covered with a white tablecloth, and in the center stood a candle, its flame flickering in the gentle breeze. Michael ordered a steak, and Savannah chose a salad with goat cheese and nuts, claiming that she wanted to feel light before the wedding. "Have you thought about what you're going to say in your vows?" she asked, taking a sip of white wine. Michael chuckled as he cut off a piece of meat. "Honestly, I thought I'd just say, 'Savannah, you're the best thing that's ever happened to me, and I promise to wash your car for free for the rest of our lives.'" She rolled her eyes, but her lips twitched into a smile. "Very romantic, Henderson. Remind me why I agreed to marry you." "Because you couldn't resist my charm and my pickup," he replied with a wink. She laughed, but then her look became more serious. "But seriously," she asked, "what do you want to happen in our lives? In 5 years, 10? Michael put down his fork and looked at her. There was something in her eyes that he couldn't quite place, a mixture of curiosity, hope, and perhaps a little worry. "I want us to be happy," he said slowly. "I want us to have a house where we can watch sunsets like this together. Maybe a couple of kids who can run around the yard and dirty all my clean cars. I want you to smile like that every day." She nodded, and her smile was warm, but there was that shadow he had noticed earlier in it again. "And you?" he asked. "What do you want?" Savannah paused, looking at her wine as if the answer might be found there. "I want freedom," she said finally. "Not in the sense that I want to run away from you." She looked up quickly, as if afraid he'd misunderstand. "I want to feel like I can be myself, like I can breathe deeply, and I want you to be here to share that with me." Her words were sincere, but there was something in them that made Michael think. Freedom was a strange word for the woman who would become his wife in 2 days, but he brushed the thought aside, writing it off as pre-wedding jitters. "You'll always be you, Savannah," he said, taking her hand, "and I'll always be here for you." She squeezed his hand back, but her gaze slid back to the window, to the dark silhouettes of the rocks that seemed to keep their secrets under the cover of night. The next day, Michael met his sister Liz at a small cafe in downtown Sedona. She had arrived that morning, along with Tony and a couple of other friends who were attending the wedding. Liz was 5 years older than Michael, with short brown hair and eyes that always saw more than he wanted her to. She sat at a table outside, sipping coffee, her expression serious, almost frowning. "So, how do you like Sedona?" Michael asked, sitting down opposite. "It's beautiful," she replied, but her tone was reserved. "Although I'd prefer you get married in Tucson. At least there aren't all those tourists with their spiritual vibrations." Michael laughed, but it was forced. "It was Savannah's idea. She says there's a special energy here." Liz raised an eyebrow. "Special energy? My God, Michael, you sound like one of those hippies selling crystals on the corner." "Maybe I am a hippie," he joked, but Liz didn't smile. "Michael," she said, lowering her voice, "I know you don't want to hear this, but are you sure you're making the right choice? You've only known her for 6 months. 6 months, Michael. You don't even know where she's from, who her family is." Michael felt irritation rising in him, but he suppressed it. "Liz, I love her, and she loves me. Isn't that enough?" "Love is wonderful," she said, looking him straight in the eye. "But love doesn't answer questions. Why was she in such a hurry to get married? Why does she barely tell you anything about her past? Have you ever been to her house? Do you know where she lived before Las Vegas?" Michael opened his mouth to reply, but found himself at a loss for words. Savannah had always been cagey about her past. She'd said she'd grown up in California, had no close family, loved to travel, and never stayed in one place for long. But she'd been short on specifics, names, addresses, stories. He'd always chalked it up to her free spirit, but Liz's words had given him pause. "She doesn't have to tell me everything," he said finally, but his voice didn't sound as confident as he would have liked. Liz sighed and placed her hand on his. "I just want you to be careful, Michael. You're a good man. Too good, sometimes. And I don't want anyone to take advantage of that." He nodded, but his mind was already filled with questions he tried to push away. When he got back to the hotel, Savannah was in their room, standing by the window, looking out over the desert. Her silhouette, illuminated by the sunset, was so beautiful that Michael forgot everything for a moment. He walked up to her, put his arm around her from behind, and she leaned into him, but her gaze was still far away. "Everything will be fine, right?" she asked quietly, almost in a whisper. "Of course," he replied, kissing her temple. "Everything will be perfect." But deep down, he felt that the desert outside his window held more secrets than he could ever imagine, and one of them might have to do with the woman he was about to call his wife. The Arizona sun seemed to have decided to celebrate the wedding of Michael Henderson and Savannah Blake in a special way. It bathed the red rocks of Sedona in a golden glow, and even the dusty air, usually so dry and prickly, that day was filled with the sweet scent of the blooming mesquite tree. The ceremony was held as Savannah dreamed, outdoors among the canyons, where the setting sun turned everything around into a flaming palette of colors. She wore an ivory dress that flowed over her figure like liquid light, and Michael, in an unusual navy suit, could not take his eyes off her. When they exchanged vows, his voice trembled with emotion, and hers rang like a crystal goblet full of promises. "I promise to be your home, Michael," she said, looking into his eyes, and there was so much warmth in her words that he felt his heart melt like wax in the Arizona sun. "Wherever life takes us, I'll be there to share every sunset with you." Michael, not usually given to sentimentality, barely held back the tears. His vow was simpler but sincere. He promised to love her, protect her, and, of course, keep her car spotless. The guests laughed, and Savannah playfully poked him in the shoulder, but her gaze was so tender that Michael was ready to swear he saw in it a reflection of their future, bright, warm, endless. Now, 3 weeks later, they were back in Tucson, in Michael's spacious house with a deck overlooking the Santa Catalina Mountains. Life seemed to have entered a new, delightful phase. Savannah had transformed their home. Vases of wildflowers appeared in the living room, jars of homemade jam in the kitchen, which she made herself while humming old tunes, and silk sheets in the bedroom, which, she said, made the night special. Michael, accustomed to his bachelor simplicity, viewed these changes with a mixture of surprise and admiration. He loved coming home from work to find Savannah dancing to the radio in the kitchen or reading a book on the deck, her long hair flowing over her shoulders, her smile promising the peace he had been searching for. But what struck him most was how quickly Savannah had become part of his life, not just his personal life, but his business life as well. His chain of Henderson clean car washes had been his pride and joy, a brainchild he had built from scratch, starting with one on the outskirts of Tucson. Now he had 6 locations across Arizona, and the business required constant attention. Supplying detergent, maintaining equipment, hiring employees, bookkeeping. Michael had always managed it himself, with the help of his manager, Tony, and a small team, but Savannah, to his surprise, began to show an interest in these details. "Michael, you can't be juggling the sink and the house all the time," she said one night as they ate dinner on the patio. The table was covered in plates of fried chicken and corn, and glasses of wine Savannah had picked out at the local liquor store. Her voice was soft, but there was a sense of confidence in it, as if she already knew what she wanted to say. "I want to help you. You trust me, right?" Michael, taking a sip of wine, looked at her with a slight smile. In the sunset light, her eyes seemed even brighter, almost hypnotic. "Of course I do," he said. "But it's boring work, Savannah. Paperwork, numbers, meetings with suppliers who are always trying to sell you something more expensive. Are you sure you want to get involved in this?" She leaned toward him, her hand sliding across the table and covering his palm. Her touch was warm, almost electric. "I want to be a part of your world, Michael," she said, and her voice was so sincere that he felt his heart clench. "You built this all by yourself, and I admire you. But I don't just want to be your wife, who cooks dinner and waits for you at home. I want to be your partner. Give me a chance." Michael couldn't refuse. That evening, he showed her the accounting reports, explained how their accounting system worked, and even gave her access to a few documents he usually kept in his office. Savannah listened attentively, asking questions, her fingers flying across the keyboard of her laptop as she took notes. Her interest seemed genuine, and Michael felt proud as he looked at her. His wife wasn't just beautiful, she was smart. She was ambitious, and damn, that made her even more attractive. A few days later, she was accompanying him to a meeting with a detergent supplier, a Mr. Garcia, whose trucks with car wash chemicals arrived once a month. The meeting was held in the office of one of the car washes, in a small room overlooking the noisy water sprayers and spinning brushes. Michael, as usual, was prepared for a long negotiation. Garcia liked to haggle, but to his surprise, Savannah took the initiative. "Mr. Garcia," she began, her voice smooth as honey, but with a slight edge of steel. "We appreciate your business, but your prices have gone up 10% in the last quarter. That's higher than your competitors. If you want to keep your contract with Henderson clean, I suggest we renegotiate." Garcia, a man in his 50s with a thick mustache and a habit of tapping his pen on the table, raised his eyebrows, clearly not expecting such pressure from a young woman in a light dress and a movie star smile. "Mrs. Henderson," he replied, drawing out his words, "prices are rising because of inflation, you know. Chemicals are getting more expensive, transportation is getting more expensive. We can't operate at a loss." Savannah leaned a little closer, her eyes glittering like a cat that had cornered a mouse. "I understand," she said, "but I also know that your competitors, like Cleantech, offer the same formula for 7% less, and their delivery is faster. We're not asking you to operate at a loss, Mr. Garcia. We're asking you to be competitive." Michael, sitting next to him, barely suppressed a smile. He had never seen anyone put Garcia in his place so deftly. The supplier cleared his throat, muttered something about being able to negotiate discounts, and within half an hour had agreed to lower the price by 8%. As they left the office, Michael put his arm around Savannah's waist and whispered, "Where did you learn to bargain like that? I thought Garcia would eat me alive, but you just smeared him." She laughed, her laugh light as the wind, but there was something else in it, a hint of triumph that Michael didn't quite understand. "You learn a lot in Las Vegas," she replied with a wink, "especially how not to get fooled." Her words lingered in his mind, but he didn't dwell on them. Savannah was his wife, his partner, and her success in business only strengthened his faith in her. He began to trust her more and more, with the keys to his office, the passwords to his accounting software, even with meetings with new clients. She was like a breath of fresh air in his life, bright, energetic, full of ideas. She suggested updating the company's logo, adding a new service polished bodywork with eco-friendly wax, and even began talking to him about expanding the chain into a neighboring state. But not everyone shared his enthusiasm. Tony, his best friend and the manager of one of the car washes, was downright wary. They met at the Rusty Cactus, an old bar on the outskirts of Tucson that served cold beer and steaks the size of plates. Tony, a burly guy with an eagle tattoo on his forearm, sat across from Michael, twirling a bottle of Corona. "Look, Michael, I don't want to pry into your family life," he began, his voice low, almost sullen. "But don't you think Savannah has taken over your business too quickly?" Michael frowned, putting down his glass. "What do you mean? She helps. And damn, she's good at it. Did you see how she dealt with Garcia?" Tony nodded, but his gaze was heavy. "Yes, I did. She's smart, that's for sure. But, I don't know, Michael. Something about her bothers me. She came out of nowhere, and now she's everywhere in your house, in your office, in your papers. Have you even checked her background?" Michael felt irritation rise within him. Tony had been his friend since they were young, but sometimes his bluntness crossed the line. "Checked her background?" he asked, his voice sharper. "Tony, she's my wife, not some employee I hire. I trust her, and you should too." Tony raised his hands in surrender. Okay, I'm just saying you have to be careful. You built this business with blood and sweat, Michael. Don't let anyone, not even her, ruin it." Michael waved it off, but Tony's words settled in his mind like sand blown into the nooks of a desert. He didn't want to think about it, didn't want to admit that there might be something wrong with his perfect life. But that night, as he lay next to Savannah, he noticed for the first time that she was whispering things in her sleep words he couldn't understand, but that sounded like a warning. The next morning, he found her in his office on his laptop. She was studying reports, her fingers flying over the keys as numbers and graphs flashed across the screen. She didn't notice him enter, and for a moment, Michael saw her face intense, almost cold, like ice in the hot sun. This wasn't the Savannah who danced in the kitchen or laughed at his jokes. This was a different woman, calculating, determined, and perhaps hiding more than he could ever imagine. "What are you doing?" he asked, trying to keep his voice light. She winced, quickly closed the laptop, and turned to him with a smile that, as always, melted his doubts. "Just seeing how things are going," she replied, standing up and walking toward him. "I want you to be proud of your wife." She kissed him, and her lips were as warm as the flowers she kept in vases all over the house. But somewhere deep inside, Michael felt a coldness, as thin as the ice that lurks in the shadows of desert rocks. The morning in Tucson began with soft light filtering through the blinds, casting golden streaks across the wood floor of Michael and Savannah's bedroom. Michael was the first to wake up, as usual, and lay looking down at his wife, who was asleep, her face buried in the pillow. Her hair, spilling over her shoulders, seemed to be woven from sunlight, and he couldn't help but smile as he watched her chest rise and fall slowly with her breathing. These moments, quiet and intimate, were like a sip of water in the desert, rare, but refreshing. He still couldn't believe that this woman, so bright and incomprehensible, was now his wife, his home, his future. But the morning's idyll was shattered by a sharp, insistent ringing of the doorbell that tore through the silence like a gunshot. Michael frowned, checking his watch. It was barely 7 in the morning. Savannah stirred, muttered something unintelligible, but did not wake. He stood quietly, pulled on jeans and a t-shirt, and went downstairs, wondering who could have come so early. When he opened the door, he saw a woman in her 50s, with neatly coiffed blonde hair and a smile that seemed both warm and slightly forced. She was wearing an elegant lavender dress and carrying a small suitcase, as if she had just stepped off a train. "Good morning," she said, her voice melodic, with a slight southern drawl that brought to mind sweet tea and hot evenings somewhere in Georgia. "You must be Michael. I'm Caroline, Savannah's mother." Michael froze, his hand still on the doorknob. Savannah's mother. He knew Savannah had little family. She'd mentioned that her father had died when she was a child, and that her mother had lived somewhere on the coast, but that their relationship had been complicated. Caroline hadn't been at the wedding, which Savannah had explained was because her mother didn't like to travel and couldn't stand crowds. Michael hadn't pressed her. He was too wrapped up in his love to delve into her family history. But here she was, standing before him, her appearance as unexpected as a thunderstorm on a clear day. "Caroline," he asked, trying to hide his surprise, "I'm glad to see you. Savannah didn't say you were coming." She smiled wider, but there was a shadow in her eyes, something Michael couldn't immediately decipher. "Oh, my girl loves surprises," she replied, waving her hand slightly, on which thin gold bracelets glittered. "I decided it was time to visit my new family. I can't remain a stranger forever, can I?" Michael nodded, still feeling slightly confused, and stepped back to let her into the house. "Sure, come in. Savannah's still asleep, but I can make some coffee." "Oh, you're quite a gentleman," Caroline said, her voice sweet as honey, but with a hint of mockery in it, as if she knew something he didn't. She walked into the living room, looking around with the air of someone who's used to taking stock of her surroundings. "It's a lovely house, Michael. Savannah told me you were well settled, but this is impressive." "Thank you," he replied, heading for the coffee maker. "We're trying." While the coffee brewed, Caroline settled herself on the sofa, crossing her legs and placing her suitcase beside her. She looked like a woman who knew how to make an impression. Her clothes were impeccable, her makeup light but carefully considered, her manner polished, like an actress accustomed to the stage. But something about her made Michael wary. Maybe it was her overly confident smile, or the way her eyes swept the room, as if searching for something valuable. Savannah showed up half an hour later, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, her face still slick with sleep. She paused in the living room doorway when she saw her mother, her eyes widening, and for a moment Michael saw something akin to worry in them, instead of joy. "Mom," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "What are you doing here?" Caroline stood up, arms outstretched as if ready to embrace the entire world. "My dear, can't I visit my only daughter and her new husband?" She walked over to Savannah and hugged her, but Michael noticed that the embrace was short, almost formal. "I'm so sorry I missed your wedding. Business, you know, but I'm here to make it right." Savannah smiled, but her smile was taut, like a string ready to snap. "You could have warned us," she said, glancing at Michael apologetically. "We would have been prepared." "Oh, nonsense," Caroline said, returning to the sofa. "I'm not one to be formal. Besides, I wanted to see how you were getting on, and I must say, you've settled in just fine. Michael stood at the kitchen island, pouring coffee into cups and handing one to Caroline. He tried to figure out what was going on between mother and daughter. Savannah was always so open, but now she seemed wary, her movements stiff, her voice quieter than usual. Caroline, on the other hand, exuded confidence, but her words sounded too smooth, like a rehearsed speech. "So, Caroline," Michael began, sitting down across from her, "Savannah said you lived somewhere in California. What do you do?" Caroline sipped her coffee, her movements graceful, almost theatrical. "Oh, I'm a widow, dear," she said, her voice softening slightly but still holding that steely edge Michael had noticed in Savannah's business meetings. "My husband, Savannah's father, left me a small fortune, and I live modestly but with dignity. I do charity work, help out at local animal shelters. Nothing special, but it keeps me going." Savannah, sitting next to him, looked down at her teacup, and Michael noticed her fingers tightening a little too tightly. He wanted to ask what was wrong, but Caroline was already continuing. "But enough about me. Tell me how things are going for you. Savannah mentioned that you have a chain of car washes, Michael. That must be so exciting. Running a business, keeping track of all those cars and money." Her tone was light, almost playful, but there was something in her words that made Michael wary. He glanced at Savannah, expecting her to continue the conversation, but she remained silent, her gaze fixed on the table. "Yes, it keeps me busy," Michael replied, trying to keep his tone casual. "But now I have Savannah, and she's a great help. Isn't she, dear?" Savannah looked up, her smile almost mechanical. "Of course," she said. "I just want everything to go smoothly." Caroline leaned forward, her eyes glittering like a cat that had spotted prey. "Oh, that's so wonderful. My girl has always been a smart girl. You know, Michael, she inherited my love of numbers. When she was little, I taught her how to budget, how to find the best deals. Right, Savannah?" Savannah nodded, but her face remained impenetrable. "Yes, Mom," she answered quietly. "You taught me a lot." Michael felt the tension between them, thin as a web, but just as strong. He wanted to change the subject, but Caroline had already turned her attention to him. "Michael, I'd love to learn more about your business," she said, her voice sweet as molasses. "Perhaps you could show me one of your sinks. I've always wanted to see how such an empire works." Michael laughed, though his laugh came out a little forced. "Empire is a strong word. But of course, I can arrange a tour. Tomorrow, if you like." "Wonderful," Caroline exclaimed, clapping her hands. "I'm sure I have a few ideas on how to make your business even better." Savannah's head snapped up, her eyes flashing. "Mom, Michael is doing well," she said, her voice firm, almost harsh. "He doesn't need advice." Caroline raised her eyebrows, but her smile didn't waver. "Oh, honey, I just want to help. We're a family now, right?" The rest of the day passed in a strange mixture of hospitality and tension. Caroline settled into the guest room that Savannah had quickly prepared and spent the evening telling stories about her life in California, her charity events, how she had always tried to give Savannah the best. But Michael noticed that her stories were vague, lacking in specifics, like a desert landscape where everything seemed the same. Savannah was unusually silent, giving short answers and avoiding her mother's gaze. The next day, Michael took Caroline to one of his car washes, the largest one on the outskirts of Tucson, where the new automatic wash machines were in operation. Caroline, dressed in a light pantsuit, looked as if she were going to a business meeting rather than a car wash tour. She asked questions, too many questions, it seemed to Michael, about revenue, about suppliers, about how they distributed profits. Her interest seemed genuine, but there was something predatory about it, as if she were looking for a weak spot. "You must be making a fortune," she said, standing at the office window and looking out at the line of cars pulling into the car wash. "So many customers, so many opportunities. Have you ever thought about selling part of the business, or maybe taking on investors?" Michael frowned, adjusting his cap. "Selling? No, that's not for me. I built this from scratch, Caroline. This isn't just a business, it's my life. She nodded, but her smile was too smooth, too polished. Of course, I understand. But sometimes a fresh perspective can open up new horizons. You don't mind if I talk to Savannah about this, do you? We could come up with something interesting together. Michael felt irritation rising inside him, but he suppressed it. Let's leave this to Savannah and me, he said, trying to keep his voice calm. We'll handle it. Caroline smiled, but her gaze was cold, like the ice that lurks in the shadows of desert rocks. That night, as he and Savannah went to bed, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Caroline had brought with her not only a suitcase, but also the shadow of old debts that might still hang over his wife. He turned to Savannah, who lay with her back to the window, and asked quietly, "What happened? Why didn't you tell me that your mother is so energetic?" Savannah was silent for so long that he thought she was asleep. But then she answered, her voice barely audible, "Because I hoped she wouldn't come." Michael wanted to ask more, but her words hung in the air like dust raised by the wind, and he realized that some answers he would have to find himself. The desert outside the window was silent, but its silence was full of secrets that, like old debts, sooner or later demanded payment. It was late afternoon in Tucson, and the desert beyond seemed to breathe with the warmth that rose from the parched earth, mingling with the scent of creosote bushes and the distant smell of rain that so rarely came to these parts. Michael Henderson stood in the office of his main car wash, looking at the income report for the last quarter, but his mind was elsewhere. In recent days, with the arrival of Savannah's mother, Caroline, a strange atmosphere had settled in his house, a mixture of hospitality and tension, as if someone had pulled an invisible string taut, ready to snap at the slightest touch. Savannah had become quieter, her smiles less frequent, but Caroline, on the contrary, filled the space with her stories, questions, and that imperious energy that made Michael feel like a guest in his own home. But his mother-in-law's arrival wasn't the only thing on his mind today. That evening, he was scheduled to meet Rick Barlow, a business partner who had recently invested in the expansion of the Henderson Clean chain. Rick was a man Michael respected but didn't fully understand. Tall, with perfectly coiffed dark hair and a smile that could sell cars faster than any dealer in Arizona. He was charismatic, witty, and, as Tony liked to say, too smooth to be honest. But his money and connections had helped Michael open a new car wash in Phoenix, and that made Rick indispensable at least for a while. Michael put the report down and glanced at his watch. Savannah was supposed to be joining them for the meeting she had insisted, saying she wanted to be in the loop. He smiled, remembering how confidently she had negotiated with the suppliers, but the smile quickly faded. Something about her behavior lately, her looks, her sudden absences, her silences made his heart clench with a vague sense of unease. Meanwhile, in a small cafe on the outskirts of Tucson, Savannah sat at a table by the window, her fingers fiddling nervously with the edge of her napkin. Across from her sat Rick Barlow, his dark eyes glittering like a predator who knows his prey is close. He wore a shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned forearms, and his smile was that same one dangerous but inviting like a mirage in the desert. "You're late," he said, taking a sip of espresso. His voice was low, with a hint of mockery that always made Savannah feel both irritated and intrigued. "I thought you'd changed your mind." Savannah rolled her eyes, leaning back in her chair. Her hair was pulled back into a high ponytail, and her flowing dress hugged her figure, drawing the gazes of the other patrons. But she only had eyes for Rick, her green eyes sparkling like emeralds in the sun. "Changed your mind?" she asked, her voice cold but slightly playful. "Rick, you know I'm not one to back down. It's just, things are a little tense at home." He raised an eyebrow, his smile widening. "Tense? Is it because of your mom? Or did your hubby start asking questions?" Savannah pressed her lips together, her fingers hovering over the napkin. "Don't call him that," she said sharply. "Michael's not. He's not a problem. He's just too trusting." Rick laughed. His laugh was deep, almost velvety, but there was something poisonous in it. "Trusting? That's putting it mildly. The guy's head over heels in love, Savannah. He looks at you like you're the only star in this goddamn desert, and you're using it. Hell, I almost admire it. She looked away, looking out the window at the cars rushing down the highway, leaving clouds of dust in their wake. Her face was unreadable, but there was a flicker of either guilt or determination in her eyes. It's not just a use, Rick, she said quietly. It's a necessity. You know how it works. You and I have a plan, and we stick to it. Rick leaned closer, his voice quieter, but with a steely edge. A plan, huh? Remind me what my role is in it. Because all I see right now is you twisting Michael around your little finger and I. What? Your little secret on the side. Savannah turned to face him, her gaze sharp as a blade. Don't act like you don't like it, she replied, her voice cold, but there was a spark in it that always ignited something between them. You're getting yours, Rick, and you'll get more if you do what I say. He leaned back in his chair, his smile becoming almost predatory. Oh, I do what you say, baby, but I want more than just your promises. What if I want more? Like a piece of that business you're so good at courting. Savannah leaned towards him, her lips so close he could feel her breath. You'll get your piece, she whispered, her voice like poison, sweet and deadly. But only if you play by my rules. Their eyes met, and for a moment the cafe, the noise of the road, the entire world disappeared. There was a connection between them, a twisted, toxic one, woven of desire and manipulation and ulterior motives. They had been seeing each other for weeks, secretly from Michael, in motels on the outskirts, in Rick's car parked in the shadows of abandoned warehouses, anywhere they couldn't be seen. It had started almost by accident, a casual brush at a business meeting, a glance that lingered too long, words that carried more than they promised. But now it was more, a game in which each of them thought they controlled the other. Later that evening, they met at the car wash office, where Michael, Rick, and Savannah were discussing expansion plans. Michael sat at his desk, his expression tired but pleased the new Phoenix car wash was bringing in more money than he expected. Rick was his usual charming self, his jokes lightening the mood, and Savannah sat nearby, her hand on Michael's, but her eyes occasionally meeting Rick's. I think we should look at opening another location, Rick said, unfolding a map of Arizona on the table. Say, Scottsdale. It's full of rich customers who are willing to pay for premium services. Michael nodded, rubbing his chin. Sounds tempting, but it's a big investment. We need more equipment, people, and advertising. Rick, are you sure your investors are ready to invest more? Rick smiled, his eyes flickering to Savannah for a moment. Oh, my investors are ready, Michael. Especially if we show them that the business is growing. Savannah, you're on board with the idea, right? Savannah nodded, her smile perfect warm, but not too revealing. Sure, she said, her voice soft as velvet. Scottsdale is a gold mine. We could add something special, like a car spa. You know, body massages, scented wax, that kind of thing. Michael laughed, squeezing her hand. A spa for cars? You sure know how to sell an idea. But Rick looked at her a little longer than he should have, and his smile was more than just businesslike. Michael didn't notice, absorbed in discussing the numbers, but a spark passed between Rick and Savannah, secret, dangerous, like lightning in the desert. Late that night, after Michael had gone to bed, Savannah sat in the guest room with Caroline. The lamplight cast shadows on the walls, and the air was heavy with unspoken words. Caroline, in a silk robe, sipped her wine, her eyes studying her daughter with the same keenness they always did. Are you sure Rick is under control? She asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. He's not the type to like being a pawn. Savannah sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her nightgown. He thinks he's a player, she said, her voice cold but weary. But he does what I want. For now. Caroline grinned, her smile sharp as a knife. Bye, she repeated. You're playing with fire, my girl. Rick Barlow is not Michael. He won't look at you with loving eyes and forgive everything you do. If he finds out that you and I... He won't know, Savannah interrupted, her voice sharpening. No one will. We're too close, Mom. Michael's business, his money, his connections, it's all almost ours. Just a few more months, and we can. Caroline raised her hand, stopping her. Don't rush this, she said, her tone as cold as ice. You're too caught up in Rick. I see the way you look at him. This isn't just a game, Savannah. You're risking everything we've worked for. Savannah clenched her fists, her eyes flashing. I know what I'm doing, she said, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. Rick is my tool. So is Michael. You taught me, Mom. Use people, their weaknesses, their desires. I do it, and I won't stop until we have everything. Caroline looked at her long and appraisingly, and then smiled, a smile that had no warmth in it. Okay, she said finally. But remember, Savannah, in this game, pawns often think they're kings. Don't let Rick become more than that. Savannah nodded, but her heart was beating faster than she wanted. She knew Rick wasn't just a pawn. He was a spark that could burn away everything she and Caroline had carefully built. But there was something in his gaze, his touch, his venomous words that drew her like a magnet. And somewhere deep inside, she was afraid that this game might not end the way they had planned. The desert outside the window was silent, but its silence was full of foreboding, as if it knew that old debts and new betrayals would soon collide like a sandstorm, sweeping away everything in its path. The dusty Arizona wind blew in, hot and stubborn, through the open window of the Henderson Clean Car Wash, stirring the papers on Michael Henderson's desk and leaving behind a fine layer of sand that seemed to seep into everything: his thoughts, his business, his life. Michael sat at his desk, staring at his laptop screen where the numbers on his balance sheet stubbornly refused to add up. For 3 days, he had been trying to figure out why revenue from one of his car washes, the one in Phoenix, was $10,000 lower than expected. He rubbed his temples, feeling the fatigue settle into his bones like sand. The last few weeks had been strange, and though he didn't want to admit it, even to himself, something in his perfect world was starting to crack. Savannah was there, as always, or at least she should have been. She'd left that morning saying she was meeting with a new supplier of eco-friendly cleaning products and promised to be back for dinner. But it was already 5 o'clock, and her phone was ringing off the hook. Michael wasn't one to panic, but her frequent absences, her evasive answers, her sudden preoccupation with matters she'd only talked about in general terms, were beginning to fit together into a puzzle he was afraid to examine in full. The office door creaked, and Tony, his best friend and the manager of the car wash, walked in. His face, usually good-natured, with a light stubble and a perpetual grin, was frowning today. He held a folder of documents in his hands, and his steps, heavy and measured, betrayed that the conversation would not be easy. "Michael, we need to talk," Tony said, throwing the folder on the table. His voice was low, almost sullen, like the rumble of distant thunder. "And you better close the door." Michael frowned but obeyed, standing and closing the office door. He returned to his desk, feeling anxiety rising in his chest like a desert wind that foretells a storm. "What happened?" he asked, sinking into a chair. "It looks like you found a skeleton in the basement." Tony didn't smile. He opened the folder and pulled out several sheets of paper covered with numbers and notes. "It's not a skeleton, Michael, but it's close," he said, his gaze as heavy as desert stones. "I checked the reports for the last 2 months, and you know what? We're in trouble. Big trouble." Michael picked up the sheets, his eyes scanning the lines, but the numbers were just a jumble of numbers. He'd never been good at bookkeeping. He'd relied on Jennifer, his older sister, to handle all of the company's finances. But Jennifer was away on vacation for 2 weeks, and Savannah had volunteered to watch the paperwork while she was gone. Michael trusted her. She was his wife, his partner, his sunshine in this damn desert. But now, looking at these reports, he felt his confidence begin to crack. "What's this?" he asked, pointing to the line highlighted in red. "Minus 15,000, is that a mistake?" Tony shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not a mistake, Michael. It's a transfer. The money went to some account I don't know anything about. And it's not the only one. Almost $40,000 have disappeared from our accounts in the last 6 weeks. Small amounts, so no one would notice. But I noticed. Michael felt his heart tighten, as if someone were squeezing it in a fist. $40,000. It wasn't just any amount of money, it was months of work, employees' salaries, new cars for the car wash in Scottsdale. He looked at Tony, hoping he'd say he was joking, but his friend's face was serious, almost grim. "Are you sure?" Michael asked, his voice hoarse, like sand was lodged in his throat. "Could it be some kind of bug in the software? Or, or one of the staff?" Tony sighed, rubbing his neck. "I wish it were that simple. But there's something else. Two of our best workers, Juan and Maria, quit last week. No explanation. Just showed up, said they were leaving, and that was it. I talked to Juan yesterday. He was drunk, but he let it slip that someone advised them to quit. Someone who knew too much about how the car wash worked." Michael sat back in his chair, his thoughts swirling like desert dust. He wanted to say that it was impossible, that no one could screw his business like that, but Tony's words echoed in his head, merging with other warning signs. The missing reports that Savannah had accidentally deleted, her frequent calls that she took in whispers, her strange wariness when the subject of money came up. "Do you think?" he began, but fell silent, unable to finish the sentence. Tony looked him straight in the eyes. "I don't think anything, Michael. I'm just showing you the facts. But you should talk to Jennifer. She'll be back tomorrow, and I'm sure she'll find more than I did." Jennifer Henderson arrived the next day, her suitcase still smelling of the sea and California sun, but her face was as serious as a judge about to pass sentence. She was 5 years older than Michael, with short brown hair and eyes that saw more than he cared to see. As the company's bookkeeper, she knew every cent that passed through the Henderson clean accounts, and her intuition was as sharp as a razor. They met in Michael's office, and Jennifer wasted no time in opening her laptop and digging through reports. Michael sat across from her, his fingers fiddling nervously with his pen, and Tony stood by the window, arms crossed. Savannah was home with Caroline, and Michael, for some reason, was glad she wasn't there. "Michael," Jennifer began, her voice calm but steely, "I found something, and you're not going to like it." She turned the laptop toward him, showing him a spreadsheet of transactions. Several of the lines were highlighted in red, each one indicating transfers to an account Michael had never seen. The amounts ranged from $2,000 to $5,000, and they were all routed through shell companies with names that sounded like something out of a pulp detective novel. Sunrise Consulting, Desert Flow Investments. "It's not just missing money," Jennifer said, her eyes fixed on her brother. "It's a fraud. Someone was deliberately moving money out of our accounts, disguising it as payments for services. And Michael, I checked the signatures on these transactions. They're in your name, but I know you didn't do it." Michael felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at Tony, then back at Jennifer, his thoughts tangling like the wires in an old truck. "That's impossible," he said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't sign anything like that. Jen, you know I trust you with all the accounting." Jennifer nodded, but her gaze was heavy. "I know, but someone had access to your data, to your passwords, to your signatures. And I found something else." She opened another folder on the screen, showing a scan of a document. "It's a contract with one of the suppliers, supposedly signed by you. But the signature, it's not yours. It's similar, but I know your handwriting. It's a fake." Michael felt his world crumble, like a sandcastle in a wind. He wanted to say it was a mistake, that it was someone on the staff, that it was an accident, but deep down he already knew it wasn't. His thoughts went back to Savannah, to her sudden interest in accounting, to her meetings with suppliers, to her evasive answers, and to Caroline, whose questions about the business were too persistent, whose smiles were too smooth. "You think," he began, but his voice broke. He couldn't say it out loud. He couldn't blame the woman he loved more than life itself. Jennifer placed her hand on his, her gaze full of sympathy, but also determination. "I don't know who did this, Michael," she said, "but I know someone close to you has access to your accounts, and I'm going to find out who." Tony, who had been silent all this time, finally spoke, his voice hoarse, as if he was holding back anger. Michael, I told you to be careful. Savannah, Caroline, this partner of yours ricked too many coincidences. You have to face the truth. Michael stood, his fists clenched, and he felt rage rise inside him, not at Tony, not at Jennifer, but at himself. How could he have been so blind? How could he have let this happen? He remembered the way Savannah had looked at him, her green eyes so warm, her smile so quick that it made his heart beat faster. Had it all been a lie? Had she? I'll talk to her, he said finally, his voice firm, but inside he could feel the cracks in his world growing deeper. Today. That night, Michael returned home later than usual. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of a clock somewhere in the living room, marking the time that seemed to be slipping through his fingers. Savannah was sitting on the couch, leafing through a magazine, her legs tucked under her, a cup of herbal tea at her side. Caroline had thankfully gone to bed, and Michael was glad to have a private conversation with his wife. "You're late," Savannah said, not looking up from her magazine. Her voice was light, but there was a hint of tension in it. "Everything okay?" Michael sat across from her, his hands clenched into fists in his lap. He looked at her, at the face he loved so much, at the hair he ran his fingers through at night, at the lips that promised him eternity. But now he saw more than that. He saw the shadows that hid behind her smile, the questions he was afraid to ask. "Savannah," he began, his voice calm but stormy. "We need to talk. About money. About business. About what's going on." She looked up, her gaze wary, but she smiled quickly, as if trying to smooth over the awkwardness. "What are you talking about, Michael?" she asked, her voice soft, almost soothing. "Something wrong with the reports? I told you, I'm not an accountant. Maybe I messed something up." He shook his head, his eyes never leaving her face. "This isn't just a mistake, Savannah. Money is missing. Tens of thousands of dollars. Signatures are forged. Documents are disappearing. And I want to know what you know about it." Her smile wavered, but she quickly pulled herself together, her eyes flashing like a cornered cat. "Michael, are you serious?" she said, her voice a little sharper. "You think I'm stealing from you? Your wife, after everything I've done for you?" He wanted to believe her, wanted her words to wash away his doubts, like rain washes away dust from deserted roads. But the cracks in his trust were already too deep. "I don't know what to think," he said, his voice hoarse with pain. "But I know someone is lying, and I'm going to find out who." Savannah looked at him, her face unreadable, but there was a shadow in her eyes, a shadow of fear or guilt or something else Michael couldn't quite place. She stood up, her movements jerky, almost mechanical. "I'm tired, Michael," she said, her voice cold as ice. "We'll talk tomorrow." She went upstairs, leaving him alone in the living room, where the silence was as heavy as the desert outside. Michael sat staring at his empty teacup and felt his world, so warm and safe a month ago, crumbling like dry earth in a wind. The cracks were deepening, and he knew that soon they would reveal the truth, a truth that might destroy everything he loved. The desert outside Michael Henderson's house was silent, but its silence was deceptive, like the calm before a storm. The wind, lazily stirring the sand behind the glass, seemed the only sound in a house where the air was charged with tension, as if before a storm. Michael sat in his office, his fingers gripping the edges of his desk, and in front of him lay the folder of documents that Jennifer, his sister, had dropped off that morning. The papers, covered in red marks, were a map to the truth he was afraid to face. $40,000 missing from his company accounts, forged signatures, missing reports, all of it pointed to betrayal, and the shadow of that betrayal was falling on the woman he loved more than life itself. Savannah, his wife, his son, his desert honey, now seemed like a mirage that would dissolve as it approached. He hadn't slept the night before, since their conversation in the living room. Her cold tone, her evasive gaze, her sharp words, they had all swirled around in his head like sand in a vortex. He wanted to believe that she was innocent, that this was a mistake, that someone else, maybe Rick Barlow, his business partner, or even Caroline, her mother was behind it. But the deeper he dug into the records, the clearer it became that Savannah was at the center of this web. She had access to the accounts, she had signed the documents, she was the one who, in recent months, had increasingly taken over the cases that had once been his alone. Michael leaned back in his chair, his gaze falling on the photograph on the table, their wedding photo, taken in Sedona. Savannah was in a white dress, her hair flowing around her shoulders, her smile so bright it outshone the sunset. He looked at her and felt his heart torn between love and pain. How could she? And why? He closed his eyes, trying to push the thoughts away, but instead his mind drifted to another place, another moment, a memory that wasn't his, but which he would later learn was the key to the solution. Flashback, 8 years ago, Nevada. It was a hot summer in Reno, but not as merciless as Arizona. The city, drenched in neon and the smell of cheap whiskey, had a life of its own. Casinos buzzed like beehives, tourists gambled away their savings, and in the shadows of the chaos, networks were woven that no one noticed until it was too late. Savannah Blake, then 20 years old, with the face of an angel and a heart as cold as ice, sat in a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Her hair was shorter, dyed dark blonde, and her eyes, still green, sparkled with calculating confidence. Across from her sat Caroline, her mother, younger, but with the same imperious bearing that made people feel smaller in her presence. "Are you sure he took the bait?" Caroline asked, her voice low, almost a whisper, so as not to attract the attention of the waitress, who was lazily wiping down a counter in the corner. Savannah smiled, her lips curling into a smile that was both charming and predatory. "Oh, he's hooked, Mom," she said, taking a sip of coffee. "David thinks I'm his ticket to heaven. He's already signed all the paperwork, given me access to his accounts. He says he wants to build us a house in Lake Tahoe. Can you imagine? A house. For us." Caroline grinned, her eyes glittering like a cat that had cornered a mouse. "Stupid man," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "They always think love makes them invulnerable, when in fact it merely makes them blind." Savannah nodded, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her napkin, but there was no nervousness in her movements, only a cool, practiced confidence. "He's already transferred 50,000 to the account you gave me," she continued. "The rest will come in a week, when he sells his business. He thinks it's for our future, poor guy." Caroline leaned closer, her voice even quieter, but there was a hint of steel in it. "Don't relax, Savannah. David Wilson is no fool. He might start asking questions if he notices the money disappearing. You have to keep him on the hook. Use everything, your eyes, your words, your body. He can't suspect anything until we're done." Savannah looked at her mother, her gaze hard, almost merciless. "Don't worry," she said. "I know how to do it. You taught me yourself." And she did. David Wilson, a 40-year-old owner of a small chain of car dealerships in Reno, was captivated by her from the moment they met. She had come into his life like a whirlwind, young, beautiful, with a story of a difficult childhood and dreams of a better life. He had fallen in love like a man falling into a pit, and before he knew it, she had begun manipulating his decisions, his finances, his heart. She had convinced him to put his money into an investment fund that she claimed would secure their future. In reality, the fund was a shell created by Caroline through shell companies, and the money was funneled into offshore accounts where no one could find it. But David wasn't as simple as they thought. One night, when Savannah returned to his apartment, he was waiting for her with a bottle of whiskey and a stack of papers in his hands. His face, usually so open and kind, was distorted with anger and pain. "What is this, Savannah?" he asked, his voice shaking as if he were holding back tears. He threw the papers on the table, bank statements, letters from lawyers, transaction requests. "You said this money was for us, but it's gone. Where did it go?" Savannah froze, her heart beating faster, but her face remained calm, like a lake on a windless night. "David, what are you talking about?" she asked, her voice soft, almost lulling. She walked up to him, her hand touching his shoulder, but he recoiled as if struck. "Don't touch me," he barked, his eyes full of pain. "I trusted you. I loved you. And you and your mother, you're just thieves. Savannah opened her mouth to protest, but that was when things went wrong. David, in a fit of rage, grabbed her arm, his fingers squeezing her wrist so tightly she cried out. She tried to pull away, but he was stronger, and there was something wild in his eyes, something she hadn't expected. In a panic, she grabbed a heavy statue from the shelf, a bronze figurine of the horse he loved so much, and hit him over the head. He fell to the floor, blood starting to spread across the carpet, and Savannah stood there, breathing hard, her hands shaking, but there were no tears or regret in her eyes, only cold calculation. Caroline, whom she called an hour later, walked into the apartment, her face devoid of emotion. She looked at David's body, at the blood, at the statue still lying nearby, and said only one thing. You did what you had to. Now let's clean this up. They worked quickly and methodically. Caroline knew how to cover her tracks. Her experience in real estate scams in the 1990s, for which she had served 3 years in prison, had taught her to be careful. They cleaned out the apartment, disposed of the evidence, and drove David's body out into the desert, where they buried it in an unmarked grave among rocks and sand. The police later found his car, abandoned on the side of the highway, and declared the case unsolved. All tracks led nowhere, like desert trails that the wind had erased overnight. Savannah and Caroline disappeared from Reno a week later, leaving behind only rumors and broken dreams. Savannah felt no guilt, she couldn't afford it. Her mother had taught her that a conscience was a luxury they couldn't afford. In their world, only those who could weave webs and avoid being caught in others' survival. Present day, Tucson. Michael opened his eyes, his breathing heavy as if he had just run a mile in the hot sun. This wasn't his dream, not his memory, but the images he saw were so vivid, so real, he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know about Reno, he didn't know about David Wilson, but his gut instinct was sharp as a blade, telling him that Savannah and Caroline were hiding more than he could ever imagine. He stood up, his steps heavy, as if he was carrying the weight of his doubts on his shoulders. In the living room, he found Savannah sitting on the couch with a glass of wine. She looked tired, her hair disheveled and her eyes dark, as if she hadn't slept either. Caroline, thankfully, was in her room, and Michael was glad he could talk to his wife alone. Savannah, he began, his voice hoarse but firm. I found something else. Transfers to an account I don't recognize. Signatures that aren't mine. Do you know anything about this? She looked up, her gaze cold, but she quickly put on a mask, the same smile that always made his heart beat faster. Michael, I told you, she said, her voice soft but steely. I don't know what you're talking about. Maybe it's a mistake, or one of your employees. You don't think I don't know what to think, he interrupted, his voice louder than he'd intended. But I know money is disappearing, documents are disappearing, and it all started when you took over the books. And your mother, she asks too many questions, Savannah. What's going on? She stood up. Her movements were sharp, almost theatrical. Are you blaming me? She asked, her voice shaking, but there was more anger in it than pain. Your wife? After everything I've done for you? I gave up my life to be with you, Michael. I help you with your business. I try to be a good wife, and you look at me like I'm a criminal. Her words were like a blow, and Michael felt his resolve begin to melt. He wanted to believe her, wanted this to be a misunderstanding. But then he remembered Jennifer's words, her cold, clear proof, and his heart sank. I don't want to blame you, he said, his voice quieter, but there was pain in it. But I need to know the truth. Savannah, if you're hiding something, tell me. Please. She looked at him, her eyes full of emotion or a clever imitation of it. She stepped closer, her hand touching his cheek, and her voice softened almost to a whisper. I love you, Michael, she said. I would never hurt you. Trust me. He looked into her eyes, trying to find the truth in them, but all he saw was a web, thin but strong, like a spider's web, that had entangled his life. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that this web was woven not only by Savannah, but by Caroline, and perhaps by someone else he hadn't seen yet. The next day, Michael decided to take action. he called a private investigator Tony had recommended, a man named Lucas Reed, an ex-cop with a reputation as solid as the Santa Catalina rocks. They met at a small bar on the outskirts of Tucson, where the smell of beer and fried wings mingled with the hum of old jazz from the speakers. Lucas was short, with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. He listened to Michael, leafing through a notebook where he jotted down key details. "So," Lucas said, his voice rough as a desert wind, "you think your wife and her mother are up to something? Missing money, forged signatures, strange behavior. You want me to dig deeper?" Michael nodded, his fingers tightening around his glass of beer. "Yes," he said. "I want to know everything. Who they are, where they're from, what they did before they came into my life. And, if there's anything else, I want to know that too." Lucas looked at him, his gaze hard but not judgmental. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Sometimes the truth hurts more than a lie." Michael swallowed, his throat dry as sand. "I have to know," he said, "even if it ruins everything." Lucas nodded, closing his notebook. "Okay, give me a couple of weeks. If there's something dark there, I'll find it." While Lucas began his investigation, Savannah and Caroline sat in the guest room, their voices hushed like the whisper of a desert wind. Caroline was as calm as ever, her movements precise, like a chess player who knows the game is already won. "He's starting to get suspicious," Savannah said, her voice tight, almost shaking. "I saw it in his eyes yesterday. He's not stupid, Mom. If he finds something—" Caroline raised her hand, her gesture as sharp as a whip. "Calm down," she said, her voice cold as ice. "Michael is in love with you. This is your best tool. Use it. Keep him hooked until we're done. A few more transfers and we'll walk away with millions. And then he can be suspicious as much as he wants." Savannah looked at her mother, her eyes full of doubt, but she nodded. "And Rick?" she asked. "He's becoming more demanding. He wants more than we promised." Caroline smiled, her smile sharp as a knife. "Rick Barlow is a pawn, Savannah. He thinks he's playing us, but he doesn't even know the rules. Let him think he's in. And when the time comes, we'll get rid of him. Like David." Savannah froze, her face turning pale, but she quickly pulled herself together. "That was different," she said, her voice barely audible. "David was a mistake." Caroline looked at her, her eyes cold as the desert at night. "A mistake?" she asked. "It was necessary, and if Michael becomes a problem, you will do the same. Because, Savannah, there is no room for conscience in our game." Savannah nodded, but her hands were shaking, and somewhere deep inside her, in the part of her she had tried so hard to hide, she felt the web they had woven begin to tighten around her. The desert outside was silent, but its silence was full of ghosts of old debts, old sins, and old graves that, like sand, could rise up at any moment and swallow everything. Tucson was sweltering, and even the air conditioning in the Henderson clean office couldn't keep up with the heat that seemed to permeate not just the air, but the souls of the people inside. Michael Henderson stood at his office window, looking out at the line of cars lined up at the car wash, but his mind was far from the gleam of chrome and the suds running down the glass. His world, so solid and secure 6 months ago, was now cracking at the seams like the parched earth in the blazing Arizona sun. The papers on his desk weren't just papers, they were a death sentence. A divorce suit filed by Savannah, demanding that he split his assets, including half of his business. Every word in the papers cut like a knife, but the accusations of emotional abuse and control cut the deepest. Michael, the man who lived for her smile, was now painted as a monster in the eyes of the law. He clenched his fists, feeling the anger and pain warring in his chest. It had started with small things: missing money, forged signatures, employees fired, but now it was a hurricane, sweeping away everything he had spent years building. And at the center of that hurricane was Savannah, his wife, the woman he loved so much that he was willing to forgive her almost anything. Almost. The office door creaked and Jennifer, his sister and accountant, walked in. Her face was grim and she was holding another folder, more evidence of his world falling apart. She threw the folder on the table, her eyes, usually so calm, now blazing with suppressed fury. "Michael," she began, her voice as hard as the rocks of Santa Catalina, "you have to see this. It's worse than we thought." He opened the folder, his fingers shaking despite his efforts to maintain composure. Inside were email printouts, customer database extracts, and a draft of a business plan that made his blood run cold. The name on the front page read, Barlow Bright, a new brand of car wash that, according to the documents, was being prepared for launch in Phoenix and Scottsdale. The name of Rick Barlow, his business partner, was written all over it, but the worst part was the customer database, a carbon copy of Henderson Clean. It was a steal, pure and simple, and Michael realized that Rick hadn't just walked away, he was planning to stab him in the back. "How did he do it?" Michael asked, his voice hoarse, like there was sand in his throat. "This base, it's password protected. Just me, you, and..." He paused, his gaze meeting Jennifer's. "Savannah." Jennifer nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "She had access to all of our systems, Michael, and I found something else." She opened her laptop and showed him a chain of emails sent from an anonymous address. They discussed details of asset transfers and expediting the divorce. The sender was unspecified, but the tone, the word choice, even the hints of an open-ended future all reeked of Savannah. "I can't prove it was her," Jennifer continued, "but I'm sure she and Rick are working together. And Michael, I think Caroline is in on this too." Michael sat back in his chair, his mind refusing to accept the magnitude of the betrayal. Savannah, Rick, Caroline, they had all been part of his life, his family, his business. And now they were weaving a web that was tightening around him like a fly. He remembered Tony's words, the warnings he'd dismissed as paranoia. Now they sounded like prophecies. "I hired a detective," he said finally, his voice quiet but steely. "Lucas Reed. He's digging into Savannah and Caroline's past. If there's anything there, he'll find it." Jennifer looked at him, her gaze full of sympathy, but also determination. "Okay," she said. "But Michael, you need to be prepared. If they did this to you, they could have done it to others. And if they did, it could be dangerous." Michael nodded, but his thoughts had already drifted elsewhere to a moment he hadn't seen, but which he would later learn was the beginning of it all. Flashback, 8 years ago, Reno, Nevada. Savannah sat in a motel on the outskirts of Reno, her fingers fiddling with the edge of the cheap bedspread as neon signs flickered outside the window, bathing the room in red and blue light. Across from her, Caroline, her mother, sat in a chair, a glass of cheap wine in her hand. Her face was calm, but there was a cold fire in her eyes, the kind that came when a plan was close to completion. "Is everything ready?" Caroline asked, her voice low, almost a whisper, so as not to wake the neighbors behind the thin walls. Savannah nodded, her face as emotionless as a desert landscape before dawn. "The money's been wired," she said. "An account in Panama. 50,000 from David, another 20 from his partner. They won't suspect a thing until it's too late." Caroline smiled, her smile sharp as a blade. "Well done, my girl," she said. "You learned quickly. But remember, no mercy. David Wilson was a mistake because you let him get too close. We can't afford another mistake like that." Savannah pressed her lips together, her gaze fixed on the floor. She didn't like to remember the night everything had gone wrong, when David's blood had stained the carpet and her hands had shaken with adrenaline. But she didn't feel guilty. Caroline had taught her that conscience was a weakness they couldn't afford. They were predators, and the world was their desert, where only those who could bite first survived. "I won't do it again," Savannah said, her voice cold as ice. "The next one will be easier. We'll find someone richer, weaker, and I won't give him a chance to ask questions." Caroline nodded, her eyes shining with pride. "This is my daughter," she said. "We will weave a net that will catch them all, and no one will find us until we want to." They left Reno 2 days later, leaving behind only rumors and the unsolved case of David Wilson's disappearance. The police searched for him, But the Nevada desert kept secrets, and the body buried among the rocks was never found. Savannah and Caroline disappeared into the crowd, their names changed, their faces masked, their pasts erased like footprints in the sand. Present day, Tucson. Michael got home late, his truck pulling up outside the house, headlights illuminating dark windows that felt as empty as his soul. He knew Savannah was home, her car was in the garage, but the thought of seeing her, talking to her, looking into her eyes that now felt like a stranger filled him with pain. He walked into the house, and the silence greeted him like an old enemy. In the living room, he found Savannah sitting on the couch with a glass of wine, her face pale, her eyes dark, as if she hadn't slept in several nights. "You're late," she said, her voice even, but there was a tension in it, like a taut string. "Business again?" Michael stopped in the doorway, his hands clenched into fists. He wanted to scream, wanted to ask how she could, but instead his voice was quiet, almost broken. "I got your papers," he said, looking into her eyes. "Divorce, emotional abuse. Do you really think I deserve this?" Savannah looked up, her gaze cold but with a hint of guilt or fear in it. She stood up, her movements fluid as a cat, but there was a hint of menace in them. "Michael," she began, her voice soft but steely, "you've changed. You've become suspicious, controlling. I can't live like this. I want freedom." He laughed, but his laughter was bitter, like a desert wind. "Freedom?" he asked, his voice growing louder. "Or do you want half of my business? Half of everything I've spent years building? Tell me, Savannah, was this your goal all along? To marry me and take it all?" Her face twitched, but she quickly pulled herself together, her eyes flashing like a blade. "You're paranoid," she said, her voice cold as ice. "I loved you, Michael, but you won't let me breathe. I filed for divorce because it's the only way out. And yes, I want my share. I worked with you, I helped you. That's my right." Michael stepped closer, his eyes burning, but there was not only rage in them, but also pain. "You're right," he said, his voice shaking. "What about the missing money, the forged signatures, the fired employees? You think I don't know that you and Rick—" He paused as he saw her face turn pale. She opened her mouth to protest, but at that moment Caroline's voice came from the hallway, soft but commanding. "Michael, dear, there's no need to shout," she said, appearing in the doorway. Her hair was done up and her silk robe made her look like an old Hollywood actress. "It won't help. Let's sit down and talk like adults." Michael turned to face her, his fists clenching even tighter. "Talk," he barked. "About what? About how you and your daughter are robbing me? Or about how Rick Barlow is stealing my customers to open his own damn car wash?" Caroline raised her eyebrows. Her smile was calm, but there was a sparkle in her eyes, as if she was enjoying the moment. "Michael, you're being overly dramatic," she said, her voice sweet as honey but venomous as a snake bite. "Rick is an ambitious man. If he's decided to start his own business, that's his right. And as for the money, maybe you just haven't been keeping track of your accounts. Business is complicated, you know." Michael felt his patience cracking like thin ice under attack. "Don't play with me, Caroline," he said, his voice low, almost menacing. "I've hired a detective. He's already digging into your past. And if there's something you're hiding, I'll find it. I promise." Savannah and Caroline exchanged glances, quick, almost imperceptible, but Michael caught the moment. It was the look of predators who know their prey is still alive, but already wounded. Savannah stepped toward him, her hand touching his chest, but he recoiled as if from fire. "Don't touch me," he said, his voice rough with pain. "I trusted you, Savannah. I loved you. And you ruined everything." She looked at him, her eyes full of emotion or a clever imitation of it. But she didn't answer, and Caroline only smiled, her smile as cold as the desert at night. "Love is weakness, Michael," she said quietly, almost in a whisper. "And you let it blind you." Michael turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the quiet of the house. He knew it was a step into the abyss toward a truth that could destroy everything he knew about his life. But he couldn't stop. The desert outside was silent, but its silence was full of promises of pain, betrayal, and perhaps retribution. Meanwhile, in an office across town, Rick Barlow sat at his desk, his fingers tapping away at the keyboard as client lists stolen from the Henderson Clean database flashed across the screen. His new brand, Barlow Bright, was about to launch, and he was confident he would outdo Michael. He smiled as he recalled his encounters with Savannah, her lips, her body, her promises that they would share whatever they took from Michael. But somewhere deep inside, he sensed that she was playing with him as well as Michael. The thought irritated him like sand in his shoes, but he shrugged it off. He was a gambler, and gamblers weren't afraid of risk. Savannah and Caroline sat in the guest room, discussing their next move. Their voices were quiet, but there was a tension in them, like the air before a storm. "He hired a detective," Savannah said, her voice shaking but trying to keep her composure. "If he finds anything about Reno." Caroline looked at her, her eyes cold as ice. "He won't find anything," she said. "We've been careful. But if he becomes a problem, we know what to do, like with David." Savannah clenched her fists, her face turning pale. "I don't want this, Mom," she said, her voice barely audible. "Michael, he's not like David. He's a good man." Caroline leaned closer, her voice sharp as a whip. "A good man?" she asked. "Good men don't survive our game, Savannah. If you want freedom, if you want money, you'll do what it takes. Or I'll do it for you." Savannah nodded, but her eyes were as dark as the desert at night. She knew the web they had woven was tightening around them all, Michael, Rick, herself. And somewhere deep inside, she was afraid that this step into the abyss would be their last. The morning in Tucson began with a deceptive stillness, as if the desert outside Michael Henderson's house were holding their breath, preparing for a storm. The sun had just risen above the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the red rocks, but the house that had once been filled with laughter and warmth now had a viscous, almost tangible tension. Michael sat at the kitchen table, his fingers wrapped around a mug of cold coffee, and in front of him lay an envelope, plain, with no return address, with his name written in a neat, unfamiliar hand. The envelope had arrived that morning, slid under the door like a message from another world, and its contents had upended everything Michael had hoped to preserve. He opened the envelope with trembling hands, even as he tried to convince himself that he was prepared for any blow. Inside were photographs, glossy and clear, taken at close range, as if someone had been tracking their target with cold, calculating precision. The first was of Savannah and Rick Barlow standing by a car parked on a deserted road, their bodies so close that there was no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The second was of them in a cafe, her hand on his, their eyes full of what Michael had once thought was love, but now saw only as betrayal. The third, the most painful, was of them kissing in the shadows of a motel, her face, so familiar and beloved, devoid of the tenderness she had given him. Accompanying the photographs was a note, written in the same neat hand. "Face it, they will destroy you." Michael looked at the pictures, and his heart seemed to be clenched in a fist he couldn't unclench. He felt anger, pain, and despair warring in his chest, but somewhere beneath the swirl of emotions, a new feeling was brewing: determination. He was no longer the naive, lovesick man who had seen Savannah as his son. He was now a man who had been betrayed, and this awakening, though painful, had given him a strength he had never known in himself before. He stood up, his movements jerky, almost mechanical, and headed for his office. There, among the papers and old bills, he found the business card of Lucas Reed, the private investigator he'd hired a week ago. Michael had met him before, but then he'd had only suspicions. Now he had proof, not just photographs, but reports from Jennifer, his sister, about missing money, forged signatures, and a stolen client database. He dialed Lucas's number, and when the detective answered, his voice was as hard as the rocks of Santa Catalina. "Lucas, this is Michael Henderson," he said, his tone emotionless but steely. "I have something new. Photos. And I want you to dig deeper. Find out everything you can about Savannah and her mother. And Rick Barlow. I want to know who they are, what they've been doing, and how far this goes." Lucas, his voice hoarse from cigarettes and years of experience, responded with a hint of mockery, but no judgment. "Looks like you're finally awake, Henderson. Send me the pictures and anything else you have. I'll start today. But I warn you, if they're what you suspect, it could get messy." "I don't care how dirty it is," Michael replied, his voice as cold as the desert night. "I want the truth, the whole truth." He hung up and looked at the photographs on the table. His gaze lingered on Savannah's face, her green eyes, her smile, which now seemed like a mask hiding something dark and dangerous. He felt his love for her dying, slowly but surely, and something new was being born in its place, a determination to protect what he had built and punish those who had tried to take it away. That same day, Michael met Jennifer in the car wash office. She was sitting at her desk, her laptop open, the screen filled with charts and graphs that she studied with manic concentration. Jennifer had always been his rock, the big sister who saw more than he did, whose intuition rarely failed. She looked up as he walked in, and her face, usually so calm, was now tense, as if she knew the news he brought would only make things worse. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," she said, her voice soft but with a hint of concern. "What happened?" Michael silently placed the photographs on the table, and Jennifer took them, frowning. She flipped through the pictures, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes dark with anger. "Bitch," she muttered, tossing the photos back onto the table. "And that bastard Rick. I told you, Michael, he was as slippery as a snake. But Savannah, I didn't think she'd go this far." Michael nodded, his fingers gripping the back of the chair he sat in. "That's not all," he said, his voice hoarse, like sand had gotten into his throat. "She filed for divorce, accuses me of emotional abuse, and wants half the business. And Rick, he's starting his own brand, Barlow Bright, with our customer base." Jennifer leaned back in her chair, her eyes flashing like lightning in the desert. "They're working together," she said, her voice cold as ice. "This isn't just an affair, Michael. It's a plan. They want to ruin you, take everything you've built. But we won't let them." Michael looked at his sister, his heart beating hard, but there was a power in her words that lifted him up like the wind lifts sand. "What can we do?" he asked. "They have access to the accounts, to the documents. And if they forged my signature, how can I prove it wasn't me?" Jennifer smiled, but her smile was not warm, but sharp as a blade. "We'll gather evidence," she said. "I've already started digging into their transactions. Those shell companies the money was going to, they left traces. Invoices, emails, dates. And I've got a couple of friends at the IRS who can help. And as for Rick, his new brand hasn't launched yet. We can sue for intellectual property theft. The customer base is our property, Michael. He's not going to get away with it that easily." Michael nodded, feeling hope rise within him, weak but stubborn, like a cactus pushing through the rocks. "What about Savannah?" he asked, his voice quieter, almost broken. What if this was all a lie from the start?" Jennifer looked at him, her gaze full of sympathy, but also determination. "Then we'll prove it," she said. "Lucas will find out what's behind their backs. And in the meantime, we'll protect your business. You're not alone, Michael. Tony and I are here." Lucas Reed worked quickly. By the end of the week, he had sent Michael his first report, and its contents were like a bolt of lightning into the dry desert. The folder Lucas handed over at a small cafe on the outskirts of Tucson contained documents, transcripts, old newspaper articles, even a police report from 8 years earlier. Michael leafed through them, his fingers shaking, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the din of the cafe. "This is just the beginning," Lucas said, sipping black coffee. His face, lined and scarred from old cases, was calm, but his eyes were cold. "Savannah Blake and Caroline Blake are not who they say they are. They have a history, and it's not pretty." Michael turned to the first page of the report. There was a 2017 Reno newspaper article about the disappearance of David Wilson, the owner of a chain of car dealerships. His car had been found on the side of the highway, but his body had never been found. Police suspected foul play, but the case remained unsolved. The article mentioned the young woman who was the last person to see him alive, a woman named Sarah Blake, whose description matched Savannah's. Sarah Blake, Michael asked, his voice hoarse with shock. Is that her? Lucas nodded, his gaze heavy as the stones in the desert. It's one of her aliases, he said. She and Caroline swapped names like gloves. Caroline did 3 years in the 90s for a California real estate scam. She was the brains, and Savannah was her weapon. They worked together, fleecing rich men who trusted their smiles too much. Reno wasn't the only case. I found leads in Oregon, Nevada, even Texas. But Reno, that's where things went wrong. David Wilson must have started asking questions, and he got taken out. Michael felt his blood run cold. Murder. The word echoed in his head like distant thunder. He looked at Lucas, his voice barely audible. Do you think they might do it again? Lucas shrugged, his face unreadable. I don't know, Michael, but I know they're dangerous. And Rick Barlow isn't just their pawn. He's a player in his own right. I found his correspondence with Savannah. They were planning not only a divorce, but also the collapse of your business. He's already met with investors for Barlow Bright. And you know what? He has a shady past petty scams, data theft, even a blackmail charge that was dropped due to lack of evidence. Michael clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. What should I do? He asked, his voice full of pain, but also determination. I can't just sit here and wait for them to destroy me. Lucas leaned closer, his voice quieter but firmer. You've already started, he said. Gather evidence. I'll give you everything I find. Take it to your lawyers. Countersue for theft, for fraud, for anything we can prove. And Michael, be careful. These people don't like to be backed into a corner. Michael came home that night, his heart as heavy as the rocks he'd seen in the desert. Savannah was in the living room, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, her eyes dark, as if she felt the web she'd woven tightening around her. Caroline was sitting next to him, her smile as smooth as ever, but Michael no longer saw her as a mother-in-law, but as a predator waiting to happen. You're late again, Savannah said, her voice even but tense. Did something happen? Michael looked at her, his eyes cold as the desert night. Yes, he said, his voice hard as a rock. It happened. I know what you're doing, Savannah. I know about Rick, about the money, about your past, and I won't let you take what's mine. Her face turned pale, but she quickly pulled herself together, her smile almost perfect. Michael, you're delusional, she said, her voice soft but menacing. You can't prove anything. Caroline stood up, her movements smooth as a cat's. Michael, dear, she began, her voice sweet as honey but poisonous as a snake bite. Don't jump to conclusions. This could end badly. But Michael wasn't listening anymore. He turned and walked out of the room, his steps heavy as hammer blows. He knew this was his awakening the moment he stopped being the hunted and became the hunter. The desert outside his window was silent, but its silence was full of promises of truth, retribution, and perhaps a new life waiting for him beyond the horizon. The desert around Tucson was hot, and even in the early morning hours, before the sun had reached its zenith, the air was heavy with foreboding. Michael Henderson sat in his pickup truck, parked outside the Tucson Police Department, his fingers gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing keeping him from falling over the edge. In the glove compartment was the file he and Jennifer had spent the last few weeks assembling. Bank transaction records, forged signatures, a stolen client database, photographs of Savannah and Rick, and, most importantly, a report from Lucas Reed, the private investigator whose findings about Savannah and Caroline's past were like a landmine waiting to detonate their carefully woven web of lies. Michael knew that turning these documents over to the police and the IRS would be a step he could never take back. But he was prepared. His heart, recently torn apart by love and pain, was now cold as the stones in the desert and firm as the determination of a man who would no longer allow himself to be deceived. He stepped out of the car, his steps heavy but sure. He was met at the building by Detective Marcos Gonzalez, a man in his 40s with tired eyes, and a voice that sounded like he had seen too many betrayals to be surprised by anything. Michael handed him the folder, his hands shaking only slightly as he spoke. "This is everything I have," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "Evidence of fraud, theft, forgery. My wife, her mother, and my former partner, Rick Barlow. They stole from my business, forged documents, and I suspect it's not the first time." Gonzalez flipped through the folder, his eyebrows rising higher with each page. He stopped at Lucas's report, which mentioned the unsolved David Wilson case in Reno, and his gaze grew razor-sharp. "These are serious allegations, Mr. Henderson," he said, putting the file down. "If what's written here is true, we'll begin an investigation immediately. But you realize this will affect your wife, and perhaps you too." Michael nodded, his eyes as empty as the desert outside the window. "I know," he said. "Do what you have to do. I want them to answer everything." Gonzalez nodded, his face unreadable, but with a hint of respect in his voice. "Okay, we'll contact the IRS and start checking their accounts. If they were moving money through shell companies like you claim, it should be easy to track. And as for Barlow, we'll check his location. Are you sure he's still in Arizona?" Michael shook his head, remembering how Rick had disappeared from town shortly after word of his new brand, Barlow Bright, began to spread. "I'm not sure," he said. "But Lucas said he might be in Nevada. He always talked about connections in Reno." Gonzalez wrote something down in his notebook, his pen moving quickly as if he could already see the net tightening around Savannah, Caroline, and Rick. "We'll look into it," he said. "And Mr. Henderson, stay away from them until we figure this out. If they're what you say they are, they could be dangerous." Michael nodded, but his thoughts were already elsewhere in the house where Savannah still lived, in her eyes that had once seemed like windows to heaven, but were now mirrors reflecting lies. He knew he couldn't stay away, not until the truth came out. That same day, Michael forwarded a copy of the documents to the IRS through his attorney, Melissa Clark, a woman with a sharp mind and a reputation for making even the most brazen fraudsters nervous. Melissa, sitting in her office overlooking downtown Tucson, leafed through a file, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes gleaming like a hunter who has scented her prey. "Michael, this," she paused, choosing her words, "is dynamite. If everything in here is confirmed, your wife and her mother will be in jail for a long time. And Barlow, his new business will collapse before it even gets off the ground. But there's one problem." Michael looked at her, his brows furrowed. "What?" he asked, his voice hoarse with fatigue. Melissa leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping on the table. "The press," she said. "Once this gets to the police and the IRS, someone's going to get wind of it. Reporters love stories like this: betrayed love, fraud, stolen millions. Your name will be in every paper from Tucson to Phoenix. Are you ready for that?" Michael clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He hated the thought of his personal life, his pain, his betrayal, becoming public knowledge. But he knew there was no other way. If he wanted his business back, his life, his pride, he had to go through with it. "Do what you have to do," he said finally, his voice as firm as a rock. "I want them to pay. All of them." Melissa nodded, her smile cold but confident. "Then here we go," she said. "I'll file a counterclaim against Savannah and Barlow, and I'll contact the IRS to speed up the audit. If they find the money was going to offshore accounts, that's game over for them." 3 days later, the Tucson police began their investigation. Detective Gonzalez and his team worked quickly, their inquiries with banks and the IRS confirming what Jennifer and Lucas had already discovered. Tens of thousands of dollars funneled through shell companies, forged signatures on contracts, and even traces of old transactions that led to accounts in Panama and the Cayman Islands. Savannah and Caroline were brought in for questioning, and though they maintained a confident demeanor, their facades began to crack. Savannah, with her perfect smile and soft voice, tried to play the victim, but her answers were evasive and her eyes were fearful. Caroline was her usual cold and calculating self, but even her steely confidence began to falter when the detectives began asking questions about Reno and David Wilson. "I don't know any David Wilson," Caroline said, her voice smooth as silk but tight. "You're trying to accuse me of something I didn't do. It's outrageous." Gonzalez looked at her, his gaze heavy as the stones in the desert. "Mrs. Blake," he said, "we have evidence linking you and your daughter to Wilson's disappearance and to the missing money from Michael Henderson's business. You can say what you like, but the numbers don't lie." Savannah, sitting next to her, clenched her fists under the table, her face pale, but she said nothing. Her eyes, usually so bright, were now as dark as the desert night, and there was a hint of panic in them. She knew the web she and her mother had woven was beginning to tighten around them. Meanwhile, Rick Barlow, sensing the ground was burning beneath his feet, fled Tucson before the police could come for him. He left his office in a hurry, taking only his laptop and a few files, and headed to Reno, where he thought his old connections would help him lie low. But Lucas Reed, whose intuition was as sharp as a blade, tracked him down 2 days later. Rick was caught in a cheap motel on the outskirts of Reno, his usually confident face twisted in fear as the cops slapped handcuffs on him. "It's a mistake," he screamed as they led him to the car. "I didn't steal anything. It was all Savannah. She set me up." But his words were lost in the sirens, and Lucas, standing off to the side, just chuckled. He knew Rick wasn't a victim, but an accomplice who thought he could outmaneuver everyone. But in this game, the pawns always fell first. By the end of the week, the story had hit the press, just as Melissa had predicted. Headlines in local papers and news sites screamed, "Car Wash Empire Scandal," "Fraud, Love, and Betrayal," "How the Owner's Wife Ruined the Business," "The Dark Past of the Tucson Beauty," "Rick Barlow Caught in Nevada," "What's Hiding Behind His New Brand." The reporters dug into the details, savoring photos of Savannah and Rick, rumors of her past in Reno, and Caroline's old affairs. Michael, whose name was mentioned in every story, felt his life becoming public knowledge, but he didn't hide. He gave one interview to a local station, his voice calm but firm as a rock. "I trusted the people I considered family," he said, looking into the camera. "But I won't let them destroy what I built. The truth will come out, and they will answer everything." His words rang through the city like a desert wind, and in the Henderson Clean office, the employees who had remained loyal to Michael looked at him with new respect. Tony, his best friend, clapped him on the shoulder, his face grim but a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "You did it, Michael," he said. "You showed them you wouldn't give up." Michael nodded, but his heart still ached. He looked out the window at the desert, its endless expanses that seemed as empty as his soul. He had won the battle, but the war was not over. Savannah and Caroline were on trial. Rick was in prison, but the truth he sought was like sand, slipping through his fingers, leaving only a bitter taste. At the police station, Savannah sat in the interrogation room, her hands cuffed but her face expressionless. She knew the game was up, but there was still a cold fire in her eyes, the fire of a woman who wouldn't give in even as the net tightened around her. Caroline, in the next room, was calmer, her smile the same, smooth as silk and venomous as a snake. She knew they had a chance to get out of this if they stuck to their story. But somewhere deep down, she sensed that Michael, the simpleton they'd underestimated, was stronger than they thought. Outside the police station, the desert was silent, but its silence was full of promises of justice that would sweep away everything in its path like a sandstorm. Michael stood by his truck, looking out at the horizon, where the sun was setting behind the mountains, and knew that his awakening, though painful, had given him the strength to begin again. He was ready to build a new world, a world where there would be no room for lies and betrayal. The year passed like sand through your fingers, leaving behind only a dry, barren desert of memories. Tucson, still the same city, surrounded by mountains and a scorching sun, seemed at once familiar and foreign to Michael Henderson. His business, Henderson Clean, was slowly but surely getting back on its feet. A new car wash in Scottsdale had opened 3 months earlier, and customers, attracted by the owner's reputation for honesty, were returning like dried-up streams after a rare rain. Michael worked tirelessly, hiring new employees, renegotiating contracts with suppliers, monitoring every cent that passed through his accounts. He had learned not to trust blindly, a lesson that had cost him almost everything he had. But despite his successes, there was an emptiness inside him, deep as the canyons of Arizona and cold as the desert nights. Michael stood in his office, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of crimson and gold. His desk was covered in papers, but one thing stood out, a framed photograph, the one taken on the day of his wedding to Savannah. It sat on the edge of his desk, a silent rebuke, a reminder of what he had lost. Savannah was smiling in the picture, her green eyes shining like emeralds, her white dress made of light. Michael, standing next to her, looked happy, happier than he had been in a year. He picked up the frame, his fingers tentatively brushing the glass, and his chest ached like an old wound that would never heal. "You're still holding on to that," a voice said behind him. Jennifer, his sister, walked into the office, her steps light but her voice as firm as ever. She stopped next to him, her gaze falling on the photograph, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Michael, you need to let go. She almost destroyed you." He nodded, his fingers still clenched around the frame. Jennifer had been right. Savannah, Caroline, and Rick Barlow had nearly ruined him. Their scam, uncovered thanks to the tenacity of Jennifer, Lucas Reed, and the Tucson police, had been a sensation that had dominated local newspapers for months. Savannah and Caroline had been convicted of fraud, forgery, and theft. Their sentences, 7 and 10 years, respectively, had been the final nail in the coffin. Rick, caught in Nevada, had gotten 5 years for intellectual property theft and complicity in the fraud. The press lapped up the details: the love triangle, the shell companies, the offshore accounts, the shady past in Reno. Michael had hated every headline, every mention of his name in connection with their lies, but he had survived. He had rebuilt his business, restored his clients' trust, proven to everyone, especially himself, that he could not be broken. But this victory was bitter, like the dust settling on the lips after a storm. "I know, Jen," he said finally, his voice hoarse, like the words were scraping against his throat. "But I look at this and I try to understand. How could I have been so blind? She was everything to me. And I didn't even see who she really was." Jennifer placed her hand on his shoulder, her touch warm but firm, like an anchor in a storm. "You loved her, Michael," she said, her voice soft but strong. "Love blinds us, but it's not your fault. She and her mother were masters of manipulation. They knew how to play on your emotions, and on the emotions of others before you." Michael set the frame back on the table, his movements slow, almost ritualistic. He knew Jennifer was right. Lucas Reed, the private investigator, had dug up enough to show that Savannah and Caroline weren't just con artists. They were predators who had preyed on gullible men for years, leaving ruined lives and empty bank accounts in their wake. David Wilson's case in Reno remained unsolved, but the evidence: Lucas had found old photographs, forged documents, neighbors' accounts indicated that his disappearance had been no accident. Michael didn't want to think that Savannah, the woman he held at night, might be capable of murder, but the shadow of that suspicion now followed him forever, like a ghost in the desert. "I don't know how to move on," he admitted, his voice quiet, almost broken. "Business is going well, but I feel empty, Jen, like she took a part of me that I'll never get back." Jennifer looked at him, her eyes full of sympathy, but also determination. "You will get yourself back, Michael," she said. "It will take time, but you are stronger than you think. You survived this. You restored everything they tried to take away, and you will do more. But you have to let her go. Not for her, but for yourself." He nodded, but his sister's words, though true, seemed as distant as the stars in the night sky. He knew he had to move forward, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw her smile, her green eyes, her lies that were so sweet he drank them in like honey. He hated himself for it, for still feeling something for her, even after everything she had done. But it wasn't love, it was a wound that still bled. That night, when Michael returned home, he found a letter in his mailbox. The envelope was plain, with neat handwriting that he would recognize among 1,000. His heart sank as if someone had squeezed it in a fist. He knew who the letter was from even before he saw the return address, Arizona State Penitentiary for Women, Perryville. He sat at the kitchen table, his fingers shaking as he opened the envelope, and his gaze fell on a sheet of paper covered in neat, almost calligraphic lines. Dear Michael, I know you don't want to hear it from me. I know you hate me, and I don't blame you. I sit here, within these four walls, and every day I think about what I did. Not about the money, not about the business, not about what your mother and I tried to take from you. I think about the way you looked at me when we were together, the way you held my hand, the way you believed in me. I didn't deserve it, but you gave it to me anyway. I'm not asking for forgiveness, because I know you won't. But I want you to know that what happened between us wasn't a total lie. I loved you, Michael. Maybe not the way you deserved, not the way you wanted, but I did. You were different, not like the people we worked with before. You were kind, you were honest, and I hated myself for what I was doing to you. But I couldn't stop. It was all I knew. It was all my mother taught me. I don't expect you to answer. I don't expect you to believe me. But I want you to know, you were the best thing I had, and I'm sorry I ruined it. Maybe in another life I would have been different. Maybe I would have been who you saw in me. Savannah. Michael read the letter 3 times, his fingers gripping the paper so tightly that it began to tear at the edges. Each word was like a knife piercing his heart, but also like the poison he had learned to recognize. He wanted to believe her, wanted to think there was some truth to her words, but he knew better. Savannah was a master manipulator, and even in prison, behind bars, she tried to play on his emotions like strings. Her love was another mask, another lie, and he was no longer the kind of person who could believe in it. He stood, walked to the fireplace, and threw the letter into the fire. The paper caught fire, its edges curling like dry leaves, and Savannah's words turned to ash that rose into the air and disappeared into the darkness. Michael watched the fire consume her words, and he felt something inside him burn, to the last spark of hope that she was something more than a predator in human form. He walked back into his office, his steps heavy but sure. The wedding photograph was still on the desk, and he picked it up, his gaze lingering on Savannah's face. He realized that it wasn't love that had ruined his life, but his own blindness, the blindness that had allowed him to see her as an angel when she was a demon. He opened the desk drawer, placed the frame inside, and closed it, as if locking the past in a chest he would never open again. The next day, Michael drove to the new car wash in Scottsdale. The morning was clear, and the desert surrounding the city seemed alive, as if it too sensed the storm had passed. He stood at the entrance, watching the cars come and go, their bodies glistening in the sun, the employees smiling as they went about their work. Tony, his best friend, came up to him, his face tired but satisfied. "Looks good, huh?" Tony said, nodding at the line of cars. "You did it, Michael. You got it back on track." Michael nodded, his lips forming a weak smile, the first in a long time. "We did it," he said, his voice quiet but strong. "Thank you, Tony, for everything." Tony clapped him on the shoulder, his grin the same as in the old days. "You're welcome, brother. But you know you need to start living, not just working. Maybe you should go somewhere, Sedona, or hell, Hawaii. Find someone who won't try to rip you off." Michael laughed, and that laugh, though bitter, was the first hint that he might feel alive again. "Maybe you're right," he said, looking at the horizon where the mountains met the sky. "Maybe it's time." He returned home that evening, his house quiet but not as empty as before. He walked into the living room where a new painting hung on the wall, a desert landscape painted by a local artist he had met at the car wash opening. It was of cacti and rocks and a sunset sky, and there was nothing but purity and strength in the landscape. Michael looked at it, and his heart, though still aching, began to beat more steadily. He knew that the emptiness inside him would not disappear overnight, but he also knew that the desert, like him, had a way of regenerating itself. From the dust and ashes, new flowers were born, new lives, new hopes. And he was ready to start again, not for Savannah, not for the past, but for himself. The desert outside his window was silent, But its silence was not empty, it was full of promise. Promises of a new day, a new life, a new Michael who would no longer be blind. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a year, he felt like he could breathe. The dust and ashes were settling, and in their place, something new was beginning to grow, something he could not yet see, but could already feel, like a warm wind that promised rain. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.